Hello, KNIZ listeners. Thanks for joining us. In this segment, we'll be talking about an important issue that affects us all, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project. Many citizens have concerns about possible expansion of this nuclear waste dump in southeast New Mexico. Our guests today are Laura Wachampino. She is part of the Laguna Acoma Coalition for a Safe Environment and also part of MACE, Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, and Don Hancock from Southwest Research and Information Center. Thanks to both of you for joining us today. Don, can we start with you about a quick history about what is WIPP?
The Waste Isolation Pilot Plant is the nation's first deep geologic repository for nuclear waste. It was first proposed in 1972, so the idea of WIPP has been around for about 50 years. And in the 1970s, it was a source of major controversy in the state. Lots of people were involved. In 1979, Congress first authorized WIPP as a pilot plant to demonstrate the safe disposal of nuclear waste. Subsequent to that, in 1981, the state of New Mexico sued the Department of Energy, and as a result of that litigation, the state agreed to WIPP happening with a lot of limitations on it. Those limitations were put into a written legal agreement between the state and Department of Energy and were later put in, and other limitations were added in 1992 to Congress passing a law called the WIPP Land Withdrawal Act. Importantly for our discussion now is those legal requirements set a maximum amount of waste that could come to WIPP, 6.2 million cubic feet, specifically limited to transuranic, which is plutonium contaminated waste from generating nuclear weapons, specifically prohibited any commercial waste, prohibited any high-level waste from coming to WIPP, and required that the state have ability to permit the facility, and the permit can put further limits on the facility. So in addition to the things I mentioned, the permit also says WIPP was going to operate for 25 years, starting in 1999 until 2024. Of course, we're getting pretty close to that 2024 date, and so WIPP has not functioned nearly as well as it was supposed to, including two significant accidents in 2014, a fire in the underground that closed the facility down and permanently disabled one worker from smoke inhalation. And then 9 days later, on Valentine's Day in 2014, an underground radiation release that contaminated significant amounts of the underground and the exhaust shaft where air comes out. And ultimately 22 workers on the surface were also contaminated as a result of that, which therefore led to 3 years that the facility was not receiving any more waste. It was trying to get back into operation. So it has about 60% of that 6.2 million cubic feet is in the underground at WIPP. And now the question is sort of what else is WIPP going to be? The Department of Energy has always had some ideas, despite signing agreements and understanding limitations in the law. The Department of Energy periodically comes up with new ideas precisely because WIPP was supposed to be the first of many repositories or multiple repositories, but WIPP is the only repository we have in the United States. So that therefore creates the situation that anybody who has any waste can think, well, maybe it should come to WIPP because there's no place else for it to go.
Thanks, Don. That was a good brief history. I understand that now there are quite a few concerns about new developments at WIPP. Laura, I'm hoping that you could speak a little to that.
Yes, the major development that we're concerned about right now is the construction of a new utility shaft to, we're not quite sure for what, probably for expansion, but the Department of Energy is saying it would be for ventilation following the accidents in 2014. But we also know that a ventilation building is due to be, it's under construction and is due to be finished by next year. So that should solve the ventilation problem. And that means the new utility shaft is not needed. However, the New Mexico issued a temporary authorization to the Department of Energy to begin construction of the utility shaft, and that has started. But that is in the absence of a permit modification that's needed for this to take place legally.
Right. Well, that's pretty serious. John, the DOE claims that this new shaft is needed for clean air, but as Laura just noted, that's probably not the case. You want to expand on that a little, please?
So two things to note about this. WIP was designed, remember we've talked about WIP was designed in the 70s. It's been through a long process, and it was designed to handle the 6.2 million cubic feet using the existing 4 shafts and the existing rooms and what are called panels underground. So this new shaft has never been needed or part of the WIP design that's been in place for more than 40 years. So that's the first thing that makes this all suspect. So it's not needed. They're putting this shaft 1,200 feet west of the existing shafts and existing rooms because they want to expand the underground area, and this shaft is part of being able to expand the underground area. And so they might use it for ventilation for this new area, but it's certainly not needed for the space that was supposed to be WIP. The other thing about it, if it's really needed, why would DOE or the state of New Mexico say you can continue to operate WIP without enough ventilation? Obviously, that doesn't make any sense either. So this is not really about ventilation. It doesn't mean all 4 existing shafts have air coming in, air going out, et cetera, waste going in and out, et cetera. So you add another shaft and it clearly will get tied in, but it's not needed for any of this. As Laura correctly said, back in 2017, November of 2017, a number of us had a meeting with the Department of Energy and the Environment Department to talk about, this idea of this new filter building that Laura mentioned and a salt reduction building and the new shaft. At the time, DOE was saying they actually needed the new shaft as part of this new ventilation system. At that meeting in November of 2017, DOE officials formally admitted that they didn't need the new shaft for this ventilation that we're talking about, which is why the new filter building, the other parts of the ventilation system went forward in 2017 and 2018, and they were actually approved, and the permit was changed in 2018 to allow this new filter building for the ventilation. But this new shaft wasn't part of any of that. So it's clearly not for the purposes of the existing operations or near-term operations. It's going to take more than 3 years to construct this shaft and the underground drifts. In the meantime, the filter building comes online next year. They'll be up to have more air in the underground, more ventilation in the underground then than they ever did before 2014. So these are just other examples of the Department of Energy trying to mislead people about what really is needed, and they really don't need this shaft except for expanding the facility to the west to create more underground space so they can put more waste into the ground.
And I have heard that this temporary authorization given by New Mexico Environment Department has allowed the shaft to begun building for this expansion of the WIP before any expansion permit has been issued to the DOE. Could one of you sort of address that, sort of clarify that for us? Laura or Don, or who would like to jump in on that?
I'll jump in, Robin. My understanding is that the Department of Energy has stated that they have a strategic plan to extend the life of WIP. At first they said through the year 2050. And now I think that they would like to actually extend it forever because of this problem of new waste being created all the time, new high-level nuclear waste. And there's no place to put it. As Don said, this is the only repository that's operating in the United States. So naturally, Department of Energy is looking here, but WIP was not designed to handle waste forever. And it was not intended to handle waste forever. And the state of New Mexico was led to believe that WIP would have a 25-year life, and the people of New Mexico are holding both the state and the Department of Energy to that promise.
And that's part of what we need people to remind the Environment Department of in these next couple of weeks, that we don't support this expansion. We do expect the New Mexico Environment Department to require that DOE fulfills their promises and to abide by the permit. Everybody agrees, DOE, NMED, and the public all agree that they've got to change the permit to allow this new shaft. But the idea of the temporary authorization, again, it's going to take 3 years to construct this shaft and the underground areas. DOE wants to go ahead and get started with it before they get the permit, before the public process and the public hearing happens. So they asked the Environment Department in January to issue this temporary authorization to let them go ahead and start constructing. 3 months later, in close coordination with DOE, when they were ready to actually start constructing, the Environment Department approved this temporary authorization. 7 weeks later, the Environment Department finally put out the draft permit for the public to comment on by August 11th. And we'd like people, as Laura just said, to say, you know, this temporary authorization is not okay, this new shaft is not okay, stop this forever WIP. Now's the time to do that, and Environment Department, do your job and stop this construction, stop coordinating with the Department of Energy essentially against the public and against the public process.
So how do people comment? This is a very serious issue. How do people comment? Where can people go? If they're listening to this broadcast, where can they go to get more information? Laura?
Well, let me explain that this permit that we're talking about is issued by the New Mexico Environment Department under the Resource Recovery and Conservation Law, and it does require public participation. So it's a problem that New Mexico Environment Department allowed Department of Energy to begin construction without a permit. And it may be called a temporary authorization, but that defies this public participation process. So people should be very alarmed that this is happening, and they can go to nuclearactive.org to get more information about the expansion of WIPP and what's happening with the construction of a utility shaft. And that would be at nuclearactive.org.
Thanks, Laura. And the deadline, if I heard Dawn correctly, is August 11th. So folks, jot this down, nuclearactive.org. And on that website, you'll find some sample comments and a link that you can click to just take your email direct to Ricardo Maestas of the New Mexico Environment Department. And it's all very clearly explained there, and it's easy to do. So we hope that you will go and do that as soon as possible. We don't have much time before August 11th. I have just a couple of more, one really important question to me, and that is early on, Dawn, I think it was you, or maybe it was you, Laura, mentioned a series of broken promises that the DOE made to the people of New Mexico. And I was wondering, hoping that you could expand upon that just a little bit.
So let me start first, and then Laura can pick up on some broader promises. Related to WIPP, as we discussed, DOE agreed to limit the amount of waste and the type of waste that can come to WIPP. They agreed to a couple of decades long lifetime for the facility to accept waste, and then it would close up. They agreed to, in this 1981 legal agreement that I mentioned, they agreed to not take any actions that require a permit before having a permit. Guess what? They've just violated that promise and that legal agreement too. So this is a kind of a continuing thing. They keep proposing, as Laura said, they keep proposing to expand the lifetime. They keep talking about bringing other waste, high-level waste from Hanford, Washington, weapons-grade plutonium from the Savannah River site in South Carolina, commercial waste from West Valley, New York. All of these are things that they have said. They've signed legal agreements, and the law all says no, they can't do those things, but they continue to propose these kinds of ideas. So it's, you know, it's a lot of promises broken. And going back to my history, back in the 1970s, a lot of people were concerned that DOE was making promises then. For example, they promised that WIPP wouldn't happen at all. In the 1970s, they promised WIPP wouldn't happen at all if the state said no. And then, you know, that promise got broken very quickly, clear back in the 70s. So there's a long history of people having good reasons to doubt that the Department of Energy is in fact going to comply with their promises and their agreements. And unfortunately, they don't even seem to feel like they need to comply with their legal agreements and what federal law requires. But, and Laura should pick up on this, that this goes into a larger history of activity of the Department of Energy and the nuclear industry and the uranium industry in New Mexico. And Laura certainly is sitting right in the middle of a lot of that in Acoma and knows a lot about it. So she should pick up on some of the broader aspects of what's happened with things nuclear in New Mexico.
Yes, so Laura, many of us feel that New Mexico has become sort of a national nuclear sacrifice area, and certainly indigenous populations have experienced that, I think, more perhaps than anybody else, and I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, uranium mining was prolific in the Grants Mining District from the 1950s until the mid 1980s. And the Grants Mining District is an area of northwest New Mexico that encompassed about 97 uranium mines and 5 uranium mills that were constructed to process the uranium. And we call this activity the front end of the nuclear fuel chain because this is where it all starts with the mining of uranium. And this area in the Grants Mining District has not been reclaimed. There are still many uranium mines that have remained unreclaimed, and on the adjacent Navajo Nation, there are probably thousands of uranium mines that are unreclaimed. So once the resource is produced, Department of Energy and other regulators tend to forget about it. Once the mining companies make their profit or they lose money, they pack up and leave. So yes, this area of New Mexico and probably all of New Mexico has become a national sacrifice area because we have given up our health, our lands, the quality of air, water, and soil is diminished after the uranium development takes place. And many people have gotten sick, suffered many diseases, and died of cancer, and are continuing to die and be affected, even though we're probably 3 generations away now from when the uranium mining first started.
I can't help but think about a dear friend, Dorothy Purley, out there from Laguna, part of the Acoma Laguna Coalition, who was one of the early indigenous voices against WIP many years ago. And I just have to put forth her memory, call out her memory, because she was an amazing activist on this. And now we have you with us, Laura. So also there's issues around transportation, as I understand it. Could you speak a little bit to that, please, Laura?
Yes, that's another way that some of our tribal communities become national sacrifice areas, because after the uranium is mined, it's usually sent to a uranium mill, or it was sent to a uranium mill for processing. So the uranium had to be transported to a uranium mill and usually cross tribal lands by rail or by highway. And talking to activists like Dorothy Purley or others, I understand that many times the uranium ore was not covered as it was transported. So communities in the transportation corridor were exposed. The uranium, the air was affected, soil was impacted, and of course the health of residents along the transportation route would have been impacted by daily exposures or however long it took to transport all this uranium.
And these new shipments from the Nevada test site, and for Lawrence Livermore, it sounds like they might come through the Laguna Acoma area to
Yes,
WIP.
they would have to come through tribal communities once again, because this waste would be transported from the West Coast through tribal communities of Acoma, Laguna, and probably the Navajo Nation, as it is taken to the WIP site in southeastern New Mexico.
So we have this expansion of this the only really nuclear waste dump here in the nation, here in New Mexico, with waste coming through tribal lands and affecting the health and well-being of people really all across the state and all across the country. We also have this possible expansion. You know, they're talking about more pit production up at Los Alamos, and this temporary authorization. I think the people of New Mexico have been pretty clear about wanting a very limited mission for WIP. And Dawn, I'm hoping you could speak a little bit to that. And then also tell us once again, either one of you, how people can take action to protect the people and the land of New Mexico.
So yes, there are these expansion proposals. As Laura mentioned, to take the 2024 date out of the permit, so that WIP could operate forever. Just as we want to have, the federal government wants to have nuclear weapons forever, that means producing more nuclear weapons will result in more of this plutonium contaminated waste with no place to go, except for WIP or leaving it where it is. So yes, people have been very concerned about this. The reason that the limits got put in place in the 70s and 80s and 90s were because a lot of people were concerned that what is now being proposed would actually happen, which is you couldn't trust the Department of Energy. Federal government could change its mind. If there weren't other repository sites, it would seem like everything should come to WIP. So I think it's very important, and people can object to this expansion, object to the temporary authorization, object to the new shaft, and remind the Environment Department and their friends and neighbors that the deal was there were going to be other repositories. And it's time for the Department of Energy and the federal government to either they need to abide by the limits on WIP, they need to start the process of developing other repositories, or start saying that as we create more waste, it's going to stay where it is, whether that's in South Carolina or at Los Alamos or in Washington or wherever, in Tennessee, wherever it might be, because New Mexico is unwilling to take all of this stuff forever. That was never the deal, hasn't been the deal for decades. It's not okay now. And whether you were involved in the fights in the 70s and 80s or you weren't, now's the time to say, no, no more. By August 11th, please submit comments to that effect and whatever else you want to say in opposition to this new shaft and the temporary authorization to the Environment Department. You can do that easily by going to nuclearactive.org. There's a sample comment letter. There's ways that you can submit emails to either by snail mail or by email to the Environment Department, Ricardo Maestas, to voice your objection. So we're hoping to have, hundreds of people saying no to this, so that the Environment Department will have to pay attention and to stop this process and to say, WIP is WIP, no to the expansion, no to the new shaft, no to not allowing the proper public process to go forward, and then to pay attention to what people are saying, which is people are saying, no, stop this, and that's what the Environment Department should do.
Yes, so stop this forever WIP. Stop this forever WIP. I want to thank you both. Do either of you have any last words that you'd like to leave folks with? Laura?
Yes, I'd like to tell everyone that wants to send a comment to the New Mexico Environment Department saying that we don't want WIP to expand forever. We don't want it to new nuclear waste forever, that we don't consent. We don't consent as members or as indigenous communities. We don't consent as citizens of New Mexico, nor should the state of New Mexico consent to being the dumping ground for more nuclear waste. We've already contributed enough, and we have to draw a line somewhere.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Yes, for sure. Again, the website to go to get involved, and for more information, there's an extensive WIP history and timeline if you want to learn more. And to make comments is nuclearactive.org. It's the Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety website. Again, that's www.nuclearactive.org. And you can find everything you need at that website to educate yourself, to know all the ins and outs, and make your comments by August 11th. Laura Wachampino of MACE, the Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, and the Acoma Laguna Coalition, also for a safe environment, and Don Hancock of Southwest Research and Information Center. I thank you both so very much for bringing attention to this most important issue. Thank you both.
Thank you, Robin.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you to KNIZ for broadcasting this information. And we hope you all have a good day and take action to protect New Mexico.
This interview was brought to you by Available Media Incorporated. The facilitator was